Our film next week is a sensitive account of the dilemma of a young man who has to confess to his parents that he's been having an affair with an older man. Welcome Home Bobby, next week at 9, here on 2. Well, the Wimbledon Tennis Championships got underway today, and Match of the Day over on BBC One in just over 10 minutes shows Boris Becker beginning the defence of his title against Karol Novacek. This is BBC Two, and now Newsnight.
Even before this week's Queen's speech, a key government policy is in danger. We talk to the backbench Tories who say no to a poll tax. Good evening. With 2 days to go before the Queen opens Parliament with its newly elected complement of MPs, there are increasing signs that Mrs Thatcher's key policy for local government is in for a stormy passage. It's the abolition of the rating system which could run into serious trouble in the Commons because of opposition on the Conservative side to the new community charge or poll tax. I'll be asking the former Minister, Sir George Young, how far he'll go in resisting the new scheme. Also tonight, the Israeli Foreign Minister, Shimon Peres, speaks out on peace in the Middle East. Today, Mr Peres briefed Mrs Thatcher on his latest contacts with Jordan and other countries. Tonight, he tells Peter Snow that Israel must move towards a peace settlement.
Later in the programme, the first chance for almost a quarter of a century to see some remarkable royal portraits. Remarkable because they were drawn by Dr Stephen Ward, the man at the centre of the Profumo scandal. We reveal where they've been hidden for the last 24 years and why. Also, the danger of sewage off Britain's holiday beaches. American scientists say our standards aren't good enough.
I do not think it prudent to release raw sewage to the coastal areas throughout the world.
All that and a look at the rest of the day's news here and abroad.
In the election campaign, one of the Conservatives' favourite tactics was to attack some Labour local authorities, the so-called loony left councils. And in their manifesto, the Tories argued strongly that their proposal for a new community charge or poll tax to replace the rates would strengthen local democracy and accountability and thus help to curb extremists in the town halls. Now, legislation for the new scheme is expected to feature in the Queen's speech on Thursday. But even before the new Parliament has been opened, there are signs that rate reform, certain to be resisted fiercely by the opposition parties, will also run into serious trouble from the government's own supporters. Before considering Tory apprehensions, a quick reminder of what the government is intending to achieve. The government's attack on local authority power is spearheaded by rates reform. They believe this will make high-spending councils more accountable to ordinary voters. Mrs Thatcher has long been convinced that the present rating system lies at the root of what she sees as the abuse of power by some councils. At the moment, local authorities get over a third of their income from domestic rates. Mrs Thatcher wants to abolish these and replace them with a community charge. This will be paid by everyone over 18, not just by property owners. Every voter will pay a flat rate related to the level of local spending. The government says this will give everyone a stake in their local services and an interest in keeping local spending down. Equally important to Mrs Thatcher's attack on high spending is her plan to abolish business rates, which at the moment account for about half of local authority rate revenue. In future, a uniform national charge will be set and collected by Whitehall for businesses and perhaps schools and public buildings. The government hopes this will encourage businesses to move into inner city areas. It also means that in future local authorities will be able to raise money only from the people who elect them to power. It's this accountability that the government hopes will make authorities look more carefully at their spending policies. All Conservatives would of course go along with the government's aim of greater accountability. But now that the election is over and won, many Tories are voicing concern about the government's chosen instrument, the new community charge or so-called poll tax. Last week, the former leader of the House, John Biffen, ousted in Mrs Thatcher's reshuffle, warned that the proposed replacement for the rates would cause the deepest anxiety, even though Mr Biffen supports the change. And Tory doubters have hardly been reassured by the recent experience of their Scottish colleagues in dealing with the rates issue. For Scotland, MPs have already passed laws which will bring in the new community charge by 1989. When the Scottish Secretary, Malcolm Rifkind, pounded the election trail, he expected that news to be a vote winner. But on the doorsteps, the new scheme aroused deep suspicion.
Good morning,
and most
Malcolm
Scottish
Rifkind.
Tories think it contributed to their poor showing in the election. After that experience, Tory MPs in England and Wales are deeply concerned.
Essentially, it hasn't been thought through. We haven't had the detailed documentation produced by the government to demonstrate how it would work. And in part because of that, but also because of the proposals themselves, there is no consensus behind it. We're talking here of a potentially long-term reform, replacing rates, been with us for many, many years, and unless we get that consensus, the first non-Conservative government will repeal it.
The first thing that's worrying many Tory backbenchers is that they're not sure whether to believe the government's assertion that the new system will produce more winners than losers. And they're concerned that the system may hit the poor but not the rich and become a political albatross. They also fear an administrative nightmare, with many people evading the new charge.
Well, two things you can say for certain is that unlike rates, which are at the higher levels broadly related to ability to pay, if people have more money, they often have larger homes. Obviously, a poll tax won't be able to reflect that. Secondly, and the government itself admits this, it'll be harder to collect. It's much harder to chase people than it is to chase a fixed building. And the problems in some inner city areas are going to be very, very big indeed.
My concern is that in saving the widow and the orphan and the single-parent family money, someone else is going to have to pay. I'm going to gain as an individual. But if I gain, someone has to lose.
There's further concern on the backbenches about what the scheme will do to business. A uniform national charge means there will no longer be any incentive for businesses to set up in Tory-controlled areas, where business rates have been traditionally low. How difficult politically will this be for the government, do you think?
I think it'll be much harder than even the government thought it would be prior to the election in light of the result in Scotland. I'm not blaming, of course. It'd be foolish to say that the Scottish result was purely because of the community charge, but it was sold in Scotland as being the deliverer of the Conservative Party. It wasn't, and many people in England and Wales will see that and be worried very much at the consequence.
In the new House of Commons, although large majorities now seem guaranteed for the government, one former minister told Newsnight Tonight that this could be the most contentious issue facing the new Parliament. Well, Sir George Young, the Environment Secretary, Mr Ridley, has been saying, despite all those fears, that when the House of Commons gets down to the details, the new plan will not be as bad as people think. Is there any concession the government could make that would reconcile you to the poll tax?
I think what many backbench Tory MPs would like to see is the new system up and running in Scotland, perhaps for a year or two, so we can see whether it delivers the goods. And then if it does, by all means, let us proceed in England. But I think it does make sense, given that the Scotland scheme is on the rails, just to let it run for a bit before we extend it to the rest of the country. And in the light of the reservations that many backbenchers are now voicing, I think we ought just to pause and see whether this is actually the solution to the problem before we go down this particular road.
Did people like yourself, though, do enough before the legislation was imposed, as you were suggesting it was, upon Scotland almost as a guinea pig, to warn of the dangers and to try and dissuade the government from adopting it in the first place?
Speaking personally, I've certainly written articles in the local government press expressing reservations about it. I think why we did it in Scotland was because Conservative MPs in Scotland said that we need this in order to hang on to our seats and get away from the problems of revaluation. And so we voted for it last December for Scotland. And I think we would now like to see if it works. And certainly so far as England is concerned, the situation is slightly more difficult because the differences in rates between one local authority and another in England are far greater than they were in Scotland. And therefore the turbulence is much greater.
Do you accept the principle, which is central to the government's thinking in this, that by bringing nearly everyone in to paying some contribution towards local government spending, this will increase accountability, and the poll tax secures that?
Well, I don't accept that, because the government has now said that those on the lowest incomes will not in fact have to pay. I think that's right. It'd be quite wrong to impose a new tax on those right at the bottom of the income scale. And my own view is that it won't change voting patterns in Lambeth or Islington and Hackney by introducing a poll tax. I think in many cases it may work the other way, that if the government does change the system and a whole lot of people find they're now having to pay a lot more, far from voting for the Conservatives, they may in fact vote against them as a rebellion against this new system.
Now, you said you'd like to see the Scottish system up and running so you could see how it was working out. Now, that essentially is an argument for postponement, and one that presumably you don't think the Environment Secretary and the government are going to produce. They're not going to go along with that.
Well, I don't see the great case for haste. At the general election in England, quite frankly, the community charge was not a great issue on the doorstep. And given the enormous problems of moving to a new system of taxation that bears no relation at all to the ability to pay, given the problems of collecting it, given the problems of enforcing it, making sure that everyone is on the register, I really do think there is quite a strong case for saying, well, hang on just a minute. This is going to happen in Scotland. Let's see if it works before we go the whole hog in England and Wales.
If the government insists on going the whole hog, though, what will you do and people like you do about it?
I think a number of Tory backbenchers will have serious reservations about voting for immediate implementation in England without any answer to the questions that have been raised by Robin Squire, by Tony Beaumont-Dark, and without really answering the question, what do we do about the enormous redistribution this is going to have away from the better off, and basically penalising those who are on lower incomes.
The key question you have to answer really is whether you will vote against the measure in the lobbies.
Well, I think that this isn't going to come till November. Between now and then, in the light of the disquiet that's now being expressed on the backbenches, I think quite a lot of negotiation will go on behind the scenes. And my point of view is quite simple. I would like to see it up and running in Scotland before I vote for it to be implemented in England.
Final point, if the negotiations behind the scenes are not successful, do enough people feel like you to bring the bill down when it comes before the House?
I think it's the most serious problem facing the government in the present legislative programme. I think this is the one thing where the government could come unstuck.
Sir George Young, thank you very much indeed. Well, apart from sport...